Hi, my name is Shana Robbins, and I'm a multimedia and performance artist, as well as an educator. And I also work with plant medicines and meditative circles as a facilitator for healing and for celebration of life, all kinds of things. So, the things that inspire me are eco-ritual. I'm really interested in eco-ritual and 1970s ecofeminism, spiritual feminism, natural environments like remote natural environments, even my backyard, my cat. I love any kind of music that runs a spectrum from like 1970s, like Fleetwood Mac, all the way to like 90s goth, and runs a whole spectrum, like Dead Can Dance. I love Latin American culture and arts. I'm inspired by that. Anything mystical or spiritually related, I'm fascinated with. Cosmology, deep ecology. And I'm also very inspired by fashion. I have a history of modeling and traveling around the world and meeting incredible designers and working with people also here in Atlanta. So yeah, all of those things are my inspirations. Feminine energy is interesting for me. There's a feminine energy and a kind of divine feminine that I think flows through everyone, no matter their gender or what their body looks like, or how they associate themselves, or how they kind of orient themselves. It's an energy that is, I would consider to be nurturing, fluid, open, following the cycles of nature like the moon. And it's something that I think is important right now. I think we're going into a more feminine time on the planet of tuning into the cycles of nature, realizing that we are co-creating this experience rather than having a hierarchical power dynamic, which is to me very kind of masculine, quote unquote. Although I tend to steer away from very distinctive terms around that. I will use masculine and feminine. And then I also have this notion in my work of the monstrous feminine. And that term has been used before in films, talking about horror films and the feminine rising up and kind of the kind of dread around that and the fear around that. So I think of the monstrous feminine as being defined as uncontrolled emotions or uncontrolled energies that rise up. Like in nature, you might consider that as very violent storms, things like that rise up out of nature. And I think of the feminine energies as rising up and reclaiming space on the planet now, as as we see, unfortunately, a lot of natural disasters and things happening. I think it's parallel for me with the feminine energy that's been so pushed down and so destroyed and so kind of attacked that it's rising. The feminine is rising. I think of myself as kind of a hollow reed or a conduit, and I do think that that energy, that kind of feminine energy, runs through me. And also, I incorporate my body usually, and I identify as a feminine form. I have to say, I don't include my body in all of my work, but when I do, I use myself as kind of a site or threshold to show that we are all interrelated beings, kind of, or patterns, or in the world that are imprinting themselves on each other. So anytime I use my body, I've kind of absorbed something from my surroundings or my habitat, or I'm co-creating with my habitat, whether it's like animals or my cat's sneezing, whether it's animals or plants or rocks or whatever is around me. And that could also be cultural elements, like from the city and from fashion things that I incorporate in. But yeah, definitely using my body as a way of creating eco-ritual and becoming like a space or a threshold or a site. And And I find that when I'm in a natural environment that's really kind of sublime, I do tend to dissolve into it. And I think we all maybe feel that way in certain surroundings. Like in the desert, we become really small, we become part of that landscape. And so I'm interested in what that looks like, how we can, or how I can, create that, show what that feels like and what that looks like through my art. Part of what has really had an impact on me is my mom was a model in the 70s, and she was one of Halston's muses. And so the women in my family have always had some kind of relationship to beauty and their physical beauty tying into their sense of worth and their sense of identity. And so for me, my work growing up with a mom who was a model and she had a very unstable early life, and so modeling for her allowed her to travel and was very liberating in a lot of ways, and to move away from that kind of traumatic early life. And at the same time, it allowed her to always change the way she looked and to kind of shapeshift all the time. Like she would come home and have like she would leave the house and have long dark hair, and then she'd come home and have a short bleached hair. So I was like, who is this person? I was always like watching her change. And that was kind of how my first idea of what it meant to be kind of a shapeshifter, or kind of a fluid being, that changes all the time. And that was a great art form for me to learn from her. So I'd love to go ahead and describe a few of my pieces for you. And let's start with this piece here. It's a piece of lace that I traveled with to Peru in 2010, I believe. And my intention for this piece was to travel with a lace to the jungles of Peru and work with a group of women, of Shipibo women who are indigenous to the northern Peru jungle. And they work with these plants, plant medicine patterns and shapes that have a lot to do with their ceremonies, in which they drink a brew that contains a plant medicine called ayahuasca. And these patterns and sound vibrations come to them, and they sing songs, and they create visual forms of those sonic patterns as well. And it's really fascinating. It's kind of like a synesthesia, where you go across the senses of sight with hearing and color. And so I traveled and I spent like 2 weeks in the jungle with these women. And so I did a show with this piece, a performance, and of course I included all of the women. I provided reciprocity for them. And it's important for me to do that, because the women who do this work in Peru, they support their families. Like a lot of the women do this work, and they're the primary, like I would say, breadwinners for their families. This piece I just finished, I think it's finished, and it's called Time Cast a Spell. So this kind of sums up what's been going on in my life and a lot of people's lives, I think, is going into the cave right now during this time of lockdown, and going into that cave and going into oneself, like kind of hermiting and going inside. And so I have this figure, which I used myself as a reference for, and I have the hair going down her body, which is inspired by Hairy Mary, which is a visual from the medieval times of Mary Magdalene, when she went off and became a hermit, and her hair grew and covered her body. So the materials here, I used chlorophyll, liquid chlorophyll. I use flower waters. So I try to kind of imbue the painting with elements of like wellness. Sometimes I'll use, different ingredients that are supposed to be good for different organs in the body. And I'll use flower waters, which are kind of like perfumed waters that people use in ceremonies and in rituals to cleanse or to uplift. And then a little bit of body glitter in there. This piece is a performance photo that I shot many, many years ago, and this is one of my, actually, I think one of my pieces that's gotten the most attention over the years, and it's called Axis Mundi, and I developed this avatar and created the costume for myself, like this eco avatar, and the mirrored mask I created, and then I took this mirror tree and brought it to this incredible glacier lagoon called Salon. It's actually now is probably a lot, more sparse. It's probably melted quite a bit since I did this performance. And in the piece I did this movement called Butoh movement that's very kind of asymmetrical, a little bit decrepit, sometimes decrepit, slow. The idea of Butoh came out of Japan post-World War II, and it was a response to, there was the dancers community's response to the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So it was very kind of ghostly and very dark in a lot of ways. But it was also a way of channeling those energies, and it's also a co-creation with the habitat that I'm performing in, or creating ritualized gestures within. And I always ask permission of the land that I go to. I always say, I say a little prayer. I ask if it's okay to be there. I try to leave an offering of some kind, maybe cornmeal or whatever feels right, or to thank the land. And that way it's a gentle way of entering into that space. And also the seals, you don't see them here, the seals were swimming in and out. So they were kind of like fascinated. They seemed fascinated, I don't know, but they were watching the whole thing. I think that traveling has opened me up as, a citizen of the universe, a citizen of the globe, a citizen of Earth, and made my sense of self much more layered and much more multifaceted, and much less static, much more fluid and open. I hope to bring an impact in some way to the people that look at my work that would, for me, ideally be one of life affirmation and also relatedness, like understanding understanding and feeling a connection with the worlds that I'm showing and sharing that with people. Sometimes it's tricky for me because I am Atlanta-based, and I think that my work I tend to show more internationally. I've shown in Mexico City and Poland and all around. But I think that because my work is personal and spiritual and political, all those different layers, it takes a very specific audience, or it takes a kind of, it tends to land better on a global audience. The performances that I do often involve ritualized spaces and ritualized actions that relate to my spirituality. And I'd like to share that with people too. Yeah, so.